Welcome, friends. This is Economic Update, a weekly analysis of major economic events and trends, the forces, both national and global, that shape our jobs, our incomes, our debts, our taxes, pretty much everything having to do with the economic part of our lives. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. I've been a professor of economics all of my adult life at several universities. Currently, I'm a visiting professor in the graduate program for international affairs of the New School University in New York City. I also write a regular column of economic analysis for truthout.org, a courageous source of independent news, news analysis, and commentary daily. Do check them out at truthout.org. If you're interested in following up or pursuing the kinds of analysis that we do on this program, please know that it is all assembled and much additional material is provided on our two websites. The first one is rdwolff.com, and the second one is called democracyatwork.info. Both of those websites contain material directly germane to what we do in this program. We add to it literally every day, and it's available to you 24/7 as you might require. Please also consider on those websites signing up for our newsletter. It is sent free, roughly once a month, and brings much of this kind of information to you directly on your email. Lastly, please continue sending me your questions, your comments, your thoughts. Both of the websites contain a mechanism for you to email to the program, and we use your comments and questions to shape the whole program, and particularly in the last 10 minutes or so to respond to those selected comments we can. Please be patient with us because we get many more, which we're thankful for, than we could possibly answer. Again, the way to reach us through email, sign up for the newsletter, and the way to do that, either rdwolff.com or democracyatwork.info. Okay, today we have a number of quick economic updates to get to before we introduce our guest and begin our interview. The first one is a kind of thank you, or maybe better spoken, happy birthday for the Social Security system. It was August 14th, 78 years ago, that in the depths of the Depression of the United States, instead of the kinds of cutbacks we hear about now, we had a very different society and a different government, and they created huge new programs to help average people rather than cut the few programs that there were. And so Social Security started, and it has survived even the cutback years in recent memory. And I thought you might be interested not only in the fact that it's happy birthday to Social Security, but some statistics. Among elderly in this country who rely on Social Security, here are the numbers. About 1/4 of the elderly, the folks over 65, rely on Social Security for 100% of what they live on. And if you know something about how modest Social Security payments are, that's saying quite a lot. But even more impressive is that 2/3, the overwhelming majority of our elderly, rely on Social Security for more than 50% of the income they live on. So Social Security is vitally important to millions and millions of Americans. Last statistic. The estimate of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, an important group in Washington, D.C., whose websites you can learn from, cbpp.org is where you go. Their estimates are that 21.5 million Americans are lifted out of the poverty level in our country because of the Social Security benefits they get, elderly. And young people, too, because you can qualify, in a sense, for Social Security if you have disabilities, and so on. 21.5 Americans are lifted out of poverty by the benefit of Social Security. Do keep that in mind in the months ahead when there will be all kinds of political leaders claiming that we have to cut Social Security in a wealthy country like ours. My second update has to do with the latest release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which has to do with real wages here in the United States. And I thought there was something you ought to be aware of. The latest statistics cover the month of July. How did things change from the end of June to to the end of July. And here's the answer. Real average weekly earnings fell 0.5%, 0.5%, in 1 month because of the drop in wages, the rise in prices, and the cutting of the average length of the work week. You put all those together, and it's 0.5%. If that lasts over a year, 12 months, we're talking a 6% real decline in the wages workers in America on average are getting. That is stunning. If you have any doubt about why this so-called recovery is as weak as it is, it's because we're not doing very much to hire the unemployed, and then what we're doing to those who have a job is cutting their real wages. Of course, no economy can emerge from such a combination of events. I want to also do some follow-up from our last program. The last program I talked a bit about how even the people getting jobs, the overwhelming majority of them are either getting part-time jobs or jobs in low-wage industries like retail sales and so on. And I got a very moving email response from a listener about what I said about part-timers. And rather than summarize, I'm going to read it to you, 2 short paragraphs from this listener's comment. Here we go. I'm one of the part-time workers, and I have been since 2008. I've been forced to work 35-hour weeks by my boss, scrambling to try and find extra work to get some extra money to compensate for this cutback. At my present job, I was cut back to 2 to 3 days a week and then had to get other work. This is not easy because you can't work the same days as you already are committed to work. So I got a second job that meant I've had to work 50 to 60-hour weeks and on weekends because although employers want you to work quote-unquote part-time, they want complete control over when you do that. What they really want is for you to work on demand when they need you. Anyway, my second job was working at a company that outsources its products or part of its products to India and then brings them back to correct the many mistakes that Indian workers make. So there I was, working part-time on the things that the company laid me off from so they could do it to India, and now I was working to fix what those other workers didn't do well in India. As a result of computer overwork and bad ergonomic workstations, I now have de Quervain's syndrome. I apologize, I don't know exactly what that is. It has damaged my wrist, and much of the extra money I got from the extra part-time job I had to spend on doctors. This is a typical story of what the current recovery is actually doing to people, and I thought you would be as interested and as moved that this person wanted to share their experience. Okay. I want to also follow up on another topic we dealt with last week, where I talked to you about the extraordinary use by Gail McLaughlin, the mayor of Richmond, California, the use of eminent domain as a right of a city to seize the underwater mortgages that are numerous in that city of over 100,000, to try to basically reduce the debt of the people living in that house, something the Obama administration had said it would do, but never really did accomplish, partly because of the opposition of banks. What I failed to mention, and what a reader brought to my attention, is that this very courageous mayor, Gail McLaughlin, is not a Republican and is not a Democrat. She's a member of the Green Party. She's a winner of the mayoral race as a Green candidate in Richmond. And I think that's beginning to show in other places that there's a demand of people for the kind of leadership that the major parties cannot, or at least will not, provide. I also wanted to point out another thing that is extraordinary, that no sooner did Gail McLaughlin indicate that Richmond was going ahead with the use of eminent domain to try to force the sale of mortgages from the lenders, the mortgage hustlers who own them at the low price so that the city could help the people living in them. The big banks went to court to stop her 12 ways to Sunday. The unpleasant reality is that the Obama administration has now entered the court procedure on the side of the lenders to block the use of eminent domain to help people in unsupportable mortgage situations. Not a good sign of what the government is doing, and it's the reality of what the government is doing, not what it says on primetime TV at night, that I want to make sure you all know. Okay. That leads me to other possible indicators of political change in America. And so I also wanted to bring to your attention someone, that I have spoken to you about before, but she's been doing real well. And her name is Kishan Sawant. She is running for the city council in Seattle, Washington. And she's running openly on the socialist line. Socialist party, not a Republican, not a Democrat, not a Green, as Gail McLaughlin is, but as a socialist. And here's the remarkable thing. In the election just completed a while ago, she got 35% of the vote. Roughly 43,000 people in that part of Seattle voted for her. And that made her the number 2 candidate, and now there has to be a runoff because no candidate got over 50%. She has a 5-to-1 ratio. That is, the incumbent running against her spent 5 times as much money as she did, but that incumbent got 47% of the vote. She got 35% of the vote. Now there'll be a write-off. An openly socialist candidate showing that there is extraordinary support for non-Republicans and non-Democrats, especially if they take strong, courageous positions, as Ms. Sawant in Seattle is doing. Since we're talking about politicians, I thought it's only fair to let you know about a few others that are in the news about economic questions. One, or rather 2, got exposed in relationship to the Walmart Corporation. This is such a lovely story that I really have to bring it to you. And in this story, Walmart is getting a government handout. That's right. Turns out that near the headquarters in Arkansas of Walmart, there is an airport almost only used to bring the jets in and out of the headquarters of Walmart, which is one of the largest corporations on this planet. And there's a tower where the airplanes have to be directed. Question: since it's an airport mainly used by Walmart, since Walmart is a multi-hundred-billion-dollar corporation, then the government, which has been trying to close towers that don't have a major use in our airports to save money, and has been closing them, wanted to close the one in this little airport outside the headquarters in Arkansas of Walmart. Politicians to the rescue. And I want to mention their names. We wouldn't want to let anybody out. Steve Womack is one, and Mark Pryor is another. Steve Womack is a Republican member of the House of Representatives, and Mark Pryor is a Democratic senator. This is a bipartisan effort. Both from Arkansas, both made sure that the government pays for the tower to subsidize, and we're talking about less than $100,000 a year. So for Walmart, this is nothing. But they got their political representatives to take care of this business. So you may not be getting a government support you need, but Walmart is taking care of business. But maybe the best of all reward or attention we can give to politicians goes to this one. Mark Wayne Mullen. He is the Republican representative from a district in Oklahoma. He made the news in the last week by announcing that he would oppose any increase of the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10 because, and I quote from the press reports, that would, and he said this to his constituent, raise the cost of a Big Mac by 400%. The idea being, if you pay the people who do the work in McDonald's an increase of 30 to 35% in their wages, they get some of the lowest wages legally allowed in the United States, we would all end up paying 4 times what we pay for hamburgers at McDonald's. That is, of course, absurd. Makes no sense that the labor cost of something goes up by 35%, the price of it goes up by 400%. Nobody in their right mind, no economist I ever heard of, would find that even remotely plausible. But the Think Progress organization did some research and came up with a lovely statistic to help drive this point home. It compared Big Mac McDonald's in Australia with the United States. Australia has a minimum wage that works out to $14.50 an hour, twice what it is in the United States. So they pay twice what we do. What's the difference in the price of a Big Mac in Australia and here? You ready? 6 cents. It's 6 cents more expensive to buy a McDonald's Big Mac in Australia than one in the United States. So Representative Mullen gets an award. Nobody has quite yet been able to say such extraordinary nonsense and get away with it as he has managed. Dubious distinction, perhaps, but he deserves it, and we don't want to take it away from him. Last short update before we turn to our interview. This has to do with a remarkable survey that got way too little attention. The results were released in July of this year. The survey was conducted by two very important organizations in Washington, D.C. The first one is called the Public Religion Research Institute, and the second one is called the Brookings Institute. Very famous organizations, and they produced a survey. They published the results. Here's the name if you're looking for it. Do Americans believe in capitalism and government as working? Do they believe that capitalism and government are working in the United States? Amazing set of questions, but much more amazing, and going back to the Sawant campaign in Seattle, are the results, and I want to tell you about them. 26% of the people who responded to the survey of these two quite well-known and well-credentialed institutes in Washington, 26% answered capitalism and government in America are, quote, not working all that well. And an additional 16% answered that capitalism and government in America are, quote, not working at all well. Wow. You put the two together, that works out to 42% of respondents in America felt that capitalism wasn't working for them. Try to imagine with me, if you can, what would happen in America and the world if there were a political party that represented, that articulated, that fought for the kinds of thinking that these 42% of our fellow citizens showed were their views about what's happening. Okay, it is now my pleasure to put aside these economic updates and turn to my guest, Laura Gottesdeiner. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to tell you all about her credentials so you know who we've got here. Laura is author of a book. It's called A Dream Foreclosed: Black America and the Fight for a Place to Call Home. This is a hot new book, literally just off the press, and will give you an understanding about the foreclosure movement in America that you will not get from the regular media, and that is an important piece of work. In addition to having this as a new book, I believe it's your first book.
It is.
Laura also, it was published by Zuccotti Park Press. Laura is a Brooklyn-based freelance journalist and associate editor at Waging Nonviolence. Her work has appeared in the following publications: Rolling Stone, Ms. Magazine, The Huffington Post, Salon, Truth Out, and Alternet. So, Laura, let's jump right in and start with a question that I've been meaning to ask people in your situation who know about this story. Tell me a little bit about what the foreclosure crisis in America is.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I was recently in something of a scuffle with another radio host, so I hope it doesn't come to that.
Yes.
Because I recently published an article with Tom Dispatch that explained how foreclosure actually works, and particularly how evictions actually work. And we'll get to in a moment how many there have been and what the sort of the collateral damage of that number has been. But, you know, I spoke to, over the last year and a half, a number of people who actually went all the way through the foreclosure process, all the way to the point of eviction, and after that. And the overwhelming number that stayed in their homes all the way up to the point of eviction explained really horrific scenes of being evicted at gunpoint, being evicted in the middle of the night, being evicted with a battering ram coming through their front door. And I wrote about this recently, and I generated a little bit of buzz, because the way we generally talk about the foreclosure crisis is it's sort of this peaceful settling of motion that we don't really understand. And this radio host incredulously said, "You mean to tell me they were evicted at gunpoint? You mean to tell me we have tolerated that over the last 6 years?" And I sort of took a moment and I said, there have been 10 million Americans evicted since 2007, forced from their homes through the bank-pursued foreclosure crisis. That's the entire population of the state of Michigan, one of the most populous states in the Union. I said, how do you think those 10 million Americans, were inspired to up and leave their homes, if not, directly or indirectly, with the threat of a loaded gun?
Right.
And
typically a sheriff comes to the house, and the sheriff is wearing a gun,
yep.
And depending on whatever is in the mood of that sheriff, who knows what's going to happen.
Typically a sheriff, if not many sheriffs, along with bank hired contractors, lots of contractors hired by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. I mean, we have, in Detroit, some residents of Detroit were telling me there were so many bank contractors, essentially private evictors for hire, that they started to call them Blackwater bailiffs. And these people were hired by the city, now going through the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, paid for by the taxpayers, private contractors hired across the country to throw 10 million Americans out of their homes.
That's extraordinary. So give me a sense, as someone who has studied this, what are the effects of throwing 10 million Americans out? Give us some sense, beyond the immediate horror of what it means to be forced out of your home, let alone at gunpoint. What are the consequences? How does this impact a city, a neighborhood, the country?
Absolutely. I think, your economic updates in terms of the austerity crisis, the cutbacks, the absurdity of politicians, certainly, all that speaks to, these collateral damages that are continuing to reverberate and worsen, frankly, in cities across the country, predominantly in cities with large populations of people of color, places like Detroit, places like Richmond, California. You mentioned the mayor and her courageous effort to use eminent domain. But what we're really seeing is terribly damaging property spirals. What happens is, and this is well studied, the IMF, one of the most conservative neoliberal organizations in the world, the International Monetary Fund, has issued many reports about this. So it's uncontested from the left to the right, neoliberal capitalists all the way to socialists. Everyone understands this. What happens is that every foreclosure drags down the property value of all of the homes in the surrounding neighborhoods. And as a result of dragging down these property values, more families are underwater on their mortgages, meaning their homes are worth less than what they have to pay. And it's well documented that homeowners who are underwater on their mortgages are more likely to go into default. So we drag down property values, more people then go into default, more people are forced out, and then comes the vacancy.
It builds on, if I'm understanding, it builds on itself.
Exactly. It's, according to the IMF, it's a contradictory foreclosure spiral. Good. In which we see this spiraling downward that, we'll get to it, but the epitome now is what we're seeing in Detroit. And when the vacancy comes, when we start to see lots of vacant properties, we start to see more and more families pushed out, the population of cities shrinking, we start to see a general just decline, plummeting of the tax base. And once the tax base declines, we start cutting schools, we start cutting hospitals, we start shuttering senior centers.
Let me just go back to make sure everybody's with us.
Absolutely.
So if a house is foreclosed and then it becomes vacant,
yes,
then basically whoever legally owns that house is highly likely to stop paying taxes because they can't afford it, just like they can't stay in the house. So the tax payments from a neighborhood that is full of foreclosure drop, so the city has less money, so now it has to cut services, which you can see is going to make life in the city harder for people, so more people will then have to be foreclosed. So it's part of that spiral.
Exactly. It's a spiral, and you're spot on, and there was one point that I also want to add is what you see when a family lives in a home, they're required to pay property taxes,
right,
and they do. And if they don't, they're foreclosed on by the city.
Right.
However, what we've seen in cities and communities across the country is when the banks take control of those homes, they don't pay property taxes. Almost half of all the bank-owned homes in Detroit right now, the banks aren't paying those property taxes. So what we went from was having a family living in a house, cutting the lawn, painting the shutters, keeping it a home where people would want to be its neighbors and contributing to the tax base of that community, to now having a vacant house, maybe broken windows, boarded up windows, weeds in the lawn, trash in the lawn, or worse, or drugs being dealt in the house, any type of illegal things happening in the house. Banks not maintaining it, not necessarily paying the property taxes. So the city, all of the city's resources, and furthermore, the city then has to step in and say, okay, this block is becoming uninhabitable. We will come and cut the lawn. We will try to maintain this house. So it can cost up to $20,000 for a city to deal with this vacant property that the bank's not paying any property taxes on, and as a result, we're just having shrinking tax bases in cities across the country. And, it leads to all of these austerity cuts that we talk about all the time, and we talk about them as if they're inevitable results of some sort of economic crisis with no perpetrators.
What I love is that I've heard stories in which the banks, having accumulated a lot of foreclosed homes, go to the city and explain that they couldn't and shouldn't be required to pay taxes. That would be a hardship. And the city agrees, not realizing the irony that had they responded to the hardship of the people who wanted some months without paying their property taxes in order to try to stay in the house, it would have been a better long-term investment in that family which wants to stay in its house than giving a break to these banks who don't need it and are busy looking for quick sales of that house. It's sort of the irony of the self-contradiction of this system.
Self-contradiction is exactly the right word. What we're doing is enforcing across the country, and the federal government stance, relative to the city of Richmond in the eminent domain question just highlights how we are continuing to follow down this absurd and contradictory path. We are enforcing the laws of neoliberal capitalism to a fault, and every time we do it, we are making decisions that negatively impact the very neighborhoods that we say will benefit from these decisions. Every single step along the way, we have had many opportunities on all levels of government to stop this crisis or alleviate this crisis, and we continue to make the government, I don't want to say we because I think you and I are trying to advocate for alternative policies, but every step along the way, the government is protecting the perpetrators of this crime and leaving the citizens, millions of Americans, just out to dry, and cities across the country. So we've seen many cities declaring bankruptcy, homelessness skyrocketing, and the banks are running the same scam right under our noses at this moment.
It's a terrible situation because we do really see it, whether you look at Detroit or Cleveland or San Bernardino in California or Camden, New Jersey. I mean, it goes on and on. In many cases, for decades of not dealing with the problem of home ownership in some rational way, allowing the banks to punish people who can't pay for a while. It's the same terrible mistake that was discovered hundreds of years ago when banks wanted to put people who couldn't repay loans in what were called debtor's prison, until they discovered that if you let a person lead his or her life, they will try, because of their own reasons, to struggle to get back into a situation where they can resume paying. But if you put them in the debtor's jail, you guarantee you'll never get paid. It is self-destructive. It's your anger at not being paid that makes you stop thinking. We're a whole society that seems to be doing that because we haven't learned the lessons of Detroit and Cleveland and Camden, and so we keep doing this. Listen, folks, we're going to need to take our normal break at this point. I'm speaking with Laura Gottesdeiner, the author of A Dream Foreclosed, a wonderful study of home foreclosures. We'll be back in a moment to continue this conversation. Please join us. Welcome back. This is Richard Wolff. This is Economic Update. I'm talking with my guest, Laura Gottesdeiner, author of A Dream Foreclosed. Laura, let's continue our conversation by picking up on something you focus on in your book, which is, tell me something about the particular way this foreclosure crisis that has swept across all communities in the United States, minorities and not, but it has particularly impacted the African American community. Yep. Tell me what your research shows about that particular impact.
I'd be happy to. From traveling across the country, following activist networks who are trying to actually do something about this, I observed that the foreclosure crisis has both disproportionately but also uniquely impacted African American communities. Disproportionately because African Americans were far more likely to be peddled and tricked into and lied to and convinced to take out predatory, completely unpayable loans. But also uniquely because what's currently happening today is part of a long historical trajectory of racial discrimination in not just home ownership or housing, but also property and personhood. So I conduct a number of interviews with homeowners and non-homeowners and activists and historians, and what they told me, and this is really a result of their knowledge, not my, dividing, but that property and personhood have always been linked in this country. Think about to the very first days of the founding of this nation, you could only vote if you own property, but you could only own property if you were a white man. So there was it was just a two-step trick to the racialized understanding of who was actually entitled to enjoy the supposed rights of this country. You can't be entitled to enjoy rights. They're supposed to be rights that extend to all. And that extends all the way up to today when we understand who counts as a person in this society. We look at predominantly people who own property, people who own homes, and people who own land in their communities. And the impact of owning something in this country is far greater than the right to do whatever you want in your house. It has to do with the decisions that are made in your community. Should we build schools in Philadelphia, or should we tear down all the schools and build a prison? Should we tear down all of the schools in Chicago? Who should own? Who should make decisions about what happens in our neighborhood? So what struck me as really visionary was that a number of the black-led anti-foreclosure organizations and housing justice organizations were advocating not only for new homeowner policies, but also for a new conception of how we understand land and control in this country. And the proposal was that we create community land trusts and other legal structures in which communities would control and have the right to make decisions about what happens in their neighborhoods. And that wouldn't only impact housing, although it certainly would impact housing, but it would also impact education, health concerns, environmental concerns. Imagine if we left, the decision of whether or not we were going to build a tar sands mine or do mountaintop removal to the communities that would actually be negatively impacted by those mines. We could see that we would have a much saner, healthier, and sustainable policy about what happens in this country if we left a lot of these decisions up to local control.
You know, it's so interesting to me, before we look at some of the specifics of what you just said, that here we are finding our way back to discover that there might be benefits to collectivizing property as opposed to private property. We've been so long in the woods about that, believing that private property is some magical guarantor of freedom and democracy, that it takes concrete investigations like yours to remind us of the ways in which private property can undermine freedom, equality, and everything else, and collective property be a better guarantor. It's a wonderful return to something we should never have lost sight of in the first place. Anyway, let me push. I want to ask you, in the time that we have, to be specific. You mentioned something that I know is in our listeners' minds, that African Americans were particularly vulnerable to being hustled into mortgages that were unsustainable. Could you say a little more about that and how you found that?
I'd be happy to. I think, I'm going to speak briefly about what happened right in this current crisis, but also how the history allowed for what happened to happen. So there are a number of good insider dispositions, meaning dispositions by loan officers actually working as mortgage pushers. Some of the best ones come from loan officers who worked at the Baltimore branch at Wells Fargo. And they described in shocking detail the way that Wells Fargo and all the banks were pushing racially discriminatory mortgages. And here are a few examples.
Good.
One of the ways was that so we all know, I think all your listeners understand, there were predatory mortgages and there were so-called prime mortgages.
Right.
And predatory, known by the industry as subprime, were the ones where you had ballooning fees, you had adjustable interest rates, and often you weren't necessarily, as a homeowner, getting a transparent understanding of how this loan worked. Those loans were peddled in minority neighborhoods, in communities of color, in the sense that the pamphlets advertising these loans were sent out far disproportionately to zip codes with African American residents. They could be printed in multiple languages. One of the languages was English. Another language was Spanish. Another language was Arabic. Another language was African American, which is not a language, but clearly demonstrates from a drop-down window on a computer system who these loans were supposed to be sold to. They were peddled in African American churches. You never, according to one disposition, ever went to a white church. You only went to African American churches. And when you went there, if you were a loan officer, only loan officers of color, only African Americans went there. So it seemed like Wells Fargo and all these other banks were sort of on the community side, but they weren't. They were exploiting the community. And I'm going to explain the historical trajectory. For the vast majority of the 20th century and all the previous centuries in this country, the federal government, has refused to lend and refused to guarantee lending in communities of color. This was called redlining. It meant that the federal government, the Federal Housing Agency, took a map of the United States and drew red lines around where anyone who was not white lived, and essentially said, nobody can lend there. And if a private bank wanted to lend there, we wouldn't guarantee it. The result of
thereby upping the risk for a bank.
Right, which meant no bank would ever go in there. So what you got was communities completely starved for investment and starved of capital in a country that operates under capitalism.
Right.
So that didn't supposedly end until the Fair Housing Act of 68, the Fair Lending Act of 77. And as a result of that, when these communities finally could access capital, when the government was finally forced, as a result of neighborhood organizing, to stop this discriminatory practice, there was this dire need for it. There was demand completely, supply and demand completely disproportionate for the rest of the country. And the banks saw this as an opportunity. They said these people had been discriminated against as a result of the federal government.
They have an immense appetite for this.
And now we will screw them over. So that's how it worked. And because the government has not taken an adequate stance now, there's no reason for me to believe that this will not be a problem in the future as well.
Just footnote from my own life. Here I am with my PhD in economics and been teaching it all my life. When I finally got a mortgage for my home and I read the mortgage, I don't remember, it had at least 20 to 30 pages of dense, small print. It took me a long time to go through it. I had to ask all kinds of questions, and they were only kind of half answered. And I remember thinking, anyone who isn't trained in this stuff, there's no way you trust whoever is throwing that document in your face to sign it, because the alternative is impossible. Yeah. You can't do it. And so it's a setup that allows for very abuse. Okay, we're running out of time, so I want to push a final question on you. There is much talk from political leaders, in the media, even from academics who should know better, that we're in an economic recovery, number one, and that the recovery is being led by a renewal of the housing industry in America. So I understand why politicians want to talk like that, starting at the top. And I know why the media pander to it, and I know why academics do. But you're doing research, you might say, from the other side, from below. Tell me whether you think there's a recovery going on in housing and in the economy as a whole in terms of what you found looking at the communities struggling with foreclosure.
So there's absolutely not a human housing recovery occurring in this country at this moment. There is a Wall Street housing recovery, and I'll explain the difference.
Good.
President Obama recently gave a speech in Phoenix lauding the housing recovery. And his primary evidence of this exemplary housing recovery was the fact that housing prices are rising across the country. In Phoenix, for example, they've risen 66%, this shocking percentage. What does it mean? And we take that for granted. Housing prices are rising. This is a godly good thing. What does it mean when housing prices rise? It means that approximately the 2/3 of Americans who own homes now have a greater asset. And it means that the lenders and Wall Street, who have large stocks in all of these houses at this point, are going to be able to make good, essentially, on their investments. However, what it means, and Dean Baker has done, an economist, has done very good writing about this, what it means is we are essentially stealing money from the bottom third of all Americans who do not own their own homes, stealing money and redistributing it to the top 2/3 of Americans who do own their homes, and straight up to Wall Street, which has a stake in these homes. So we are, because...
How does that work? Yeah.
Because the 2/3 of Americans who do not own their homes need to pay higher rental prices, because the rental rates are skyrocketing across the country. If they wanted to own a home, they would have to pay a larger amount of their small income.
Just let me interrupt you.
Yep.
So one of the reasons, if I understand you, one of the reasons that rents are shooting up is that all these people who used to be home owners can't and are forced into the limited rental market.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
So we had more than 4.5 million households evicted recently. Those are 4.5 million families
who have to rent.
Who have to go rent. So there's a huge demand. So we're taking, this is a redistribution from the bottom to the top. And that is what Obama essentially just celebrated. Yet, at the same time, he's talking about how it is completely unfair. We have such economic disparity in this country. We don't want that. But I want to make one more point about why these rental rates are rising. Sure. And the reason they are rising is because very large private equity corporations and hedge funds, so huge banking institutions, not banks, but private equity companies and hedge funds, are betting right now that owning huge tracts of foreclosed homes is going to be a good investment. For example, the Blackstone Group, one of the largest private equity companies in the world, has invested $4.5 billion, large amount of that in cash, to buy up tens of thousands of foreclosed properties across the country, particularly in communities of color. What does this mean? Two things. One, families who want to actually just go buy a home are now betting and competing against, or at the auction, competing against private equity companies with trucks of cash left outside. It's not a fair bet, and lots of families are complaining in communities. But the second and more troubling thing to me is that once again, we are going to see a situation where communities, particularly communities of color, do not own the land or the homes in which they are living and will not be able to make significant decisions about what happens in their communities and how life is organized and run unless we change the situation and unless we start to say we need to value human needs more than capital, because whether or not Blackstone Group owns 30,000 foreclosed homes in this nation does not mean they should now set the terms of what it means to live in the United States.
Or that we should once and again condemn the African American community to the status of renters in the houses they were hustled into owning, have now been deprived of, and that furthers the divisions in this society that anyone who isn't crazy would understand is a serious social problem that these hedge funds and bankers are actually making worse by their profit. Laura, it's been wonderful. I wish, as always, that we could do more, but I want to thank you very much, both for writing A Dream Foreclosed and for spending some time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, folks, in the time that remains, I want to respond to a couple of your questions that are very good, and indeed, some of these are questions that many of you aim at, so I try sometimes to put them together. One set of questions is about demographics, what's happening to populations in this country and around the world, and particularly to the changing proportions of older and younger people that are particularly dramatic in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, among other places. And the questions go like this. Since we have a disproportionate number of people leaving the labor market, becoming so old that they retire or switch to part-time work and so on, will there be a labor shortage? In other words, can we expect perhaps that wages will go up again because employers will have a smaller pool from which to draw the younger folks versus the older ones? And I'm afraid the answer there is no, that's not likely going to happen, because the most important economic event, perhaps, of the last 30 years is the bringing into world capitalism of a huge labor force that had been outside of it before. I'm talking mostly about the people of India, China, Brazil, all around the world, who were colonial territories, basically kept on subsistence agriculture on the farms where they eked out a difficult living for the last 100 years. But with the development of modern jet travel and telecommunications and the internet, they have been brought in, finally, as workers in the way that you would expect in a capitalist system. They're desperate. They have been very poor. They want jobs. And so their leaders in India, China, Brazil, turn to capitalists in the West and say, hey, you're paying a lot for wages because you've struggled with your unions for 100 years. Why don't you come down here where people are willing to work for much, much less? And American, European, and Japanese capitalists, have been responding to the call because they see profits. We are at the beginning of that process. And so I would expect that as the labor market gets smaller in North America, Europe, and Japan, and each of these areas has this problem, capitalists are not about to give them higher wages because they have still cheaper workers that they haven't begun to find in Vietnam, in Malaysia, in Paraguay, fill in the blank, Africa coming down the pike also this way. Also, to deal with demography, to deal with the fact that you have a disproportionate imbalance between older and younger people means you would have to plan your economics. You'd have to organize what you do economically, the jobs you create, the schooling you give, the way you develop your cities, taking into account your population. But we don't like planning. We don't want the government to do it. Nobody else is doing it. So it's catch as catch can. Each corporation trying to make money off of whatever the situation is, and then we live with the results as a community, even though we don't plan anything as a community. That's a critique of our system. That's not a problem of demographics. It's a problem of how the society deals with demographic issues. And last question that comes up, what will happen to real estate values? In other words, as older people, as more and more people are old, they don't need a large living space, they want a small living space. Will that mean a collapse of real estate values? We built up the real estate of the United States basically around the concept of the suburb. America used to be a place, as most countries were, where you had rural people with land and urban people who lived in apartments. We used to call them tenements. They were renters. We created, and this country was a leader of that, a new category, the suburb, which was neither urban nor rural. It wasn't a farm, but it wasn't a city tenement either. It was this house with land and a garage and a car. And if we're seeing that part of our population shrink as older people become more important numerically, what's going to happen to the suburbs? Well, you could make a case if our society was homogeneous, if it was all the same, you could worry a little bit about that. But that's not the way our society works. Our society, more than in 30, 40 years, perhaps even more than 100 years, is becoming extremely unequal. It is dividing into rich and poor. But that's rich and poor cities, rich and poor suburbs, rich and poor rural areas. That is the dominant division occurring in our society. Not between old and young, and not between well-educated and less well-educated. It is a gap in rich and poor. And so what I foresee, if you're interested in real estate, is a gap between cities like New York that become the center for people with a lot of money, San Francisco, Phoenix, so forth, and cities that are Detroit, Cleveland, Camden, Youngstown, Ohio, where I was born, that kind of city, a city of the poor. And what's more interesting is that the suburbs are replicating that more and more. Poor suburbs, rich suburbs. The division is shaping what happens to real estate, the division of income, more than anything demographic. In the final few moments that we have, there is a huge topic, but I want to introduce it today, and we'll continue with it next week. And this is the question, what is capitalism? And why do I bring it up? Well, the real reason is that capitalism has re-entered the public discussion and debate. For the last 50 to 60 years, because of the Cold War that erupted after the end of World War II, and that the legacy of that Cold War is still with us, it was impossible to have a reasonable, balanced conversation about capitalism. You couldn't have a conversation about what are the strengths of capitalism? What are the weaknesses? Is it to be fixed? And if so, how? Is it beyond fixing, so it has to be replaced? The kinds of logical, honest questions that you would address to any system. We've been doing that in this country. We've been questioning our school system. We've been questioning our sexual relationship systems, our marriage systems. We question our energy system, our transportation system, and we ask the reasonable questions. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the way we've done this? Can it be fixed? If so, how? And if it can't be fixed, do we have to replace it with a better system? That's a way reasonable people deal with the systems that make up their lives. And we've done that pretty well in the United States in many areas, but not in economics, and for sure not with capitalism. Instead of a discussion about the strengths and weaknesses, we have a society whose leadership competes for being cheerleader for capitalism. Republicans are cheerleaders, Democrats contest with them. Look in the congressional record for a debate or an honest evaluation of capitalism, you won't find it. Whenever capitalism comes up, somebody is trying to make a career move by celebrating it even more over the top than the next guy who stands in the political arena. And it's been true in our media, and it's been true in our academic life. But it has changed. The collapse of capitalism over the last 5 or 6 years, the American dream slipping further and further away from people's hopes for the future, a young generation of students accumulating a level of debt that is impossible to make a life with. Everywhere you turn, unemployment, the foreclosures that Laura discussed with us today, wherever you turn, even if you have a job, the benefits are being reduced. The security of the job is being reduced. Wherever you turn. So capitalism turns out to have flaws, to not work real well. Look at those results of the poll at the beginning of today's show. But in order to have a conversation about capitalism, we have to question what we've thought it means. And so starting next week, I'm going to be talking about why we need to question not just whether capitalism is good or bad, but what in fact we mean by it. We're going to begin a conversation about what capitalism is, and it turns out people have very different ideas about how you define that thing, and you got to go through figuring that out before you can hope to change to something better or different. Thank you again, as always. Thank you, Laura Gottesdeiner, for being with me. This is Economic Update. I am Richard Wolff, and I hope you will join me again next week.